On the freezing cold night of the 8th of February, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan was sitting around a roaring fire. He was with a big group of men deep inside a valley in western Colorado. The men gathered around that fire, Israel included, were all gold prospectors. That meant they spent their lives traveling the western United States, always looking for that next big score of gold. But for the past several weeks, this particular group of prospectors had been completely trapped in this valley. A series of terrible winter storms had moved in one after another, and each time a new storm hit, it would dump up to 6 feet of fresh snow, making any kind of travel impossible. They were stuck. On this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire just enjoying the warmth of the flames and listening to the other men tell stories, one of his friends stood up. This friend was another gold prospector, and his name was Alfred Packer. Alfred stood up and basically started to pitch an idea to the whole group. He wanted them to come with him and leave the valley right now. Alfred told everyone that the weather was starting to turn. He argued that it wasn't as bad as it had been, that the snow was even starting to melt a little, and then he made a big promise. Alfred said he knew a pathway out of there, a route that would take them out of the valley in just 2 weeks. Not only that, but this path would lead them directly to Breckenridge, Colorado. Breckenridge was a place that was well known by every prospector in the region. It was famous for having lots and lots of gold. So Alfred was essentially telling them, this is a win-win situation. We can finally get out of here, and we can get rich in the process. After Alfred finished his pitch, he sat back down. For a moment, everyone just stayed quiet. Israel kind of looked around the fire, watching the faces of the other men, trying to see if anyone was going to take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew that, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't really like Alfred. They often said he was lazy and difficult to be around. But Israel had a feeling that wasn't the real reason they didn't like his friend. He believed the real reason that other people didn't like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy. This meant that from time to time, he would have seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability on long, difficult journeys like this. On a trek through the mountains, the whole group really needs to be able to rely on every single person. Everyone needs to be able to pull their own weight. So, they were worried about a guy who at any given moment could just become kind of useless because he was in the middle of a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy didn't really matter all that much. He didn't see Alfred as some huge liability. In his eyes, Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. So, for him to stand up and make this pitch, it just felt like it was in keeping with who Alfred was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to blindly follow him and go along with this big plan. But he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing the pros and cons in his head, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire. He saw one of the other men, a really big guy, sitting there looking incredibly serious. And this big man was just shaking his head slowly back and forth as if to say, no, you guys can't seriously be considering leaving early. Then the big guy stood up. He held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically signaling for him to not say another word. Then this guy, while still looking directly at Alfred, spoke to the whole group. He said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And with that, the big guy just sat back down again. A tense silence fell over the entire group around the fire. Everyone just sat there, the only sound being the crackling of the flames. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different from everyone else sitting around that fire. His name was Ure, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabaguash band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Ore had, in fact, saved the lives of every single person sitting around that fire, Israel and Alfred included. Just a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up completely lost in this very valley, which was the valley where Chief Ore lived with his tribe. He had found them stumbling around in the snow on the absolute brink of death as the storms raged. So, Chief Ore and his people had brought the prospectors food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river. And then Chief Ore gave them some simple advice. He told them to stay put in this campsite and just ride out the winter. Then, in the springtime, when all the snow melts, it would be safe for all of them to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were nothing but thankful. They were just totally thrilled that Chief Ore had found them and given them this campsite. It was a lifeline. And so they had no problem at all agreeing to wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being more or less trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried that if they didn't leave soon, all the good spots would be taken and there would be no more gold left for them to mine. For Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold. He had told his family back home that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. This was his final shot. So, he really couldn't afford to go home empty-handed. He literally needed to find gold in order to continue to survive and to take care of his family. So, when Alfred stood up again and broke that tense silence, he spoke directly to Chief Ore. He said, "Thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early, and I just hope others will come with me." At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred's eyes. And Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. So, Israel spoke up. He said, "You know what? I'll go with you as well." And then, after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ore could tell that he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. So, even though he felt like this was a truly terrible idea, he shifted his focus. He went from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were about to go into. So he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him. Then Chief Ore knelt down and drew a map in the dirt on the ground. He told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that they had to follow the river out of the valley. He explained that it would bring them to a mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range. And he was very clear. He told them, "You cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You have to follow that river and go around the mountain range." He said that once they did that on the other side, there would be an outpost where they could stop, get supplies, rest up, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then, after Chief Ore had explained all of this, he made sure to mark a big X on his dirt map, showing them exactly where that outpost would be. And with that, Chief Ore just turned around, walked over to his horse, and rode away. Shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night, their minds made up. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they all got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors, a man who had not volunteered to go with them and who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward. He said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go using his horse. But at some point, he would have to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. The men were very thankful for this offer. And so, shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go. They said their goodbyes, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they started to see it off in the distance. The huge, jagged peaks of the San Juan mountain range. But they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path that Chief Ore had told them about, because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. As Israel trudged through the deep snow in a single file line of men, he held on tightly to a metal coffee pot. Inside this pot, he kept hot coals from the fire. This was a little trick he had learned over the years. Not only did it keep his hands warm in the brutal cold, but also, if he ever ran out of matches, he could easily start a new fire using the coals. It was a simple but effective tool for survival. And so, as he's clutching this wonderfully warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him. He turned around and saw it was Alfred. And Alfred looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel felt. And so, without even thinking about it, Israel just handed his warm coffee pot off to Alfred. Alfred took it and clutched it to his chest, and his face showed obvious relief and thankfulness. Now, none of these gold prospectors had ever struck it rich. They were all basically poor men chasing a dream. But of all of them, Alfred really had the least. He had almost nothing to his name. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. There was also the age difference. Alfred was 30 years old, which was half the age of Israel. So Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid who was just trying to find his way in the world. Alfred had also confided in Israel about his past. He told him that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions. He wanted to fight against the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they had kicked Alfred out because of his epilepsy. But that hadn't stopped Alfred from getting a tattoo on his arm with his battalion information and his name. Unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he had misspelled his own name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so, when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D, and from that point on, that was what people called him. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And this was kind of a source of embarrassment for him. And then, after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of just bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down anywhere and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help, a little bit of kindness. So, after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flask with some alcohol in it. He handed it to Israel almost as a silent thank you for giving him the warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing the flask and the coffee pot back and forth between them. By late afternoon that day, the snow was really starting to come down hard again. The prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he finally reached a point where he had to stop. He said his horse just couldn't go any farther, the weather was getting too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies in the snow, wished them luck, and then he turned his horse around and headed back down the trail toward the valley. And it's very likely that as these 6 men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the exact same thought. I just have to suck it up for 2 weeks, get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. 2 weeks passed by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Array had pointed out. The one that was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was supposed to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by. And still, they did not show up at the outpost. And they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas either. They had simply vanished. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving slightly. It was snowing less. But within just a couple of days of this group setting off on their trip, those brutal winter storms came back with a vengeance. They just dumped incredible amounts of snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey were the men themselves, and also Chief Ouray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay behind in the valley until spring. But even if Chief R.A. and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in serious trouble, there was nothing they could do. They would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley themselves and basically couldn't do anything. And so, in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wilderness, but nobody even knew they were missing. But that would all change on the 16th of April, 1874. This was roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost, the same one that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast inside one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open. These officials, they all turn around and they see a man standing in the doorway. He was a totally disheveled-looking guy with long, matted hair that was sticking up in the air and a huge, bushy beard. In one hand, he was holding a rifle, and in the other hand, he was clutching a metal coffee pot. His eyes were darting like crazy from side to side, and he was clearly in a state of shock. He was trying to speak, but he just couldn't get any words out. This man was Alfred Packer. And it was obvious to the officials that this man was in dire need of help. And so, without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door against the cold, got him some food, and got him some water. Immediately, Alfred started wolfing down the food as fast as he could until he began vomiting. At which point, he apologized profusely to the men. He said, "I've been starving out in the wild for weeks. It must have done something to my intestinal tract. It's probably damaged." But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over their floor. They were just worried that this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put him in some warm, dry clothes. Then Alfred asked them if they had any whiskey. He said he wanted to kind of warm his body up from the inside. They said no problem, and they handed him some whiskey. Alfred threw a couple of shots back, and after that, it was pretty obvious that he had kind of relaxed a little bit. And at that point, one of the officials finally asked Alfred the question that was on all of their minds. "What happened to you?" As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials his story. He said that he had been with 5 other men, and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, a huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the path they were on. And so, the group made a fateful decision. They decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range, the one thing Chief Ouray had specifically told them not to do. He had said, "Do not go over the mountains." They decided to do that anyway. But as they were trying to traverse these treacherous mountains, it became clear that Alfred just was not keeping up with the rest of the group. And so, he said, they made the decision to leave him behind. To leave him behind to die. He knew he was being abandoned, and he had to watch as his 5 friends disappeared into the blowing snow. But amazingly, Alfred told them he did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months just stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going. He survived by eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the one thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was that when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. The one Israel had given him, and so at night he was able to start fires to stay warm. He also told them that at one point he was so hungry that he had cooked his own leather shoes in the fire and ate them. Because again, this guy was starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he just randomly stumbled into this outpost and found their cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, "Have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive?" And they would have to tell him, "No, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else." Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It had been 2 months since they had started that journey. The chances were just not good that they had survived the harsh winter in the mountains. But even if these other men were somehow not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to even begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search party because he's the only one who knows where they could possibly be. But Alfred was in no condition to go back out into the wild and lead a search. He was not healthy enough. And so, for several weeks, Alfred just stayed at the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so, it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On the 20th of August, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado. He was roughly in the same area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible, horrible smell. And so, John followed the smell until it brought him to a clearing. And in the clearing was what looked like an old, beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who might be in this campsite. But when he turned a corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze. Because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men, all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in complete shock from what he was seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether. And the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically just skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lifelike that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies. And when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chests, looked surgical. Like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not the result of random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away were the remains of a burned-out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods. And he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there. But it had all the signs of someone living there for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together in his mind, and John realized what he had just stumbled upon. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered. And the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or maybe even months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This was a cannibal's camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so, kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook he carried with him, he quickly sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out that John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was supposedly left behind to die, those 5 other men didn't carry on into the night. Somebody attacked them, began killing them, and then eating them. And that person was Alfred Packer. That was why Alfred had survived for so long out in the wilderness. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night. It was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even exactly when he killed them. All we know is that based on the investigation of the scene, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered. But the 5th victim, who was actually Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was in self-defense, and that somebody else killed the other 4. His story was kind of confusing despite those claims. There was one thing Alfred never denied, and that was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. When they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But, despite it being right there, a fresh source of food, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that instead. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 59 years old, he was granted parole. And right away, Alfred became a vegetarian. He died a few years later, taking the full story of what truly happened in those mountains to his grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 1993, David Lewis was a man who seemed to have it all. He was a successful and well-respected lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas. He had a loving wife, Karen, and a beautiful 9-year-old daughter. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, the kind of guy who coached his daughter's sports teams and spent his free time helping out with local charities. His life was stable, predictable, and happy. On January 28th of that year, a Thursday, Karen and their daughter were getting ready for a fun weekend trip. They were heading to Dallas, a few hours away, for a mother-daughter shopping spree. It was something they were both really looking forward to. Normally, David would have tagged along, making a family trip out of it. But this particular weekend was a big one for sports fans. The Super Bowl was on that Sunday, the 31st, and David didn't want to miss it. He was a huge fan and wanted to enjoy the game from the comfort of his own home. So he said his goodbyes, and Karen and their daughter drove off to Dallas, leaving David to have the house to himself for a couple of days. They had their trip, and then on Sunday, after the big game had finished, they made the drive back home to Amarillo. As they pulled into the driveway, they were expecting to walk in and find David either cleaning up some game day snacks or maybe watching the post-game analysis. When they stepped inside, the house was quiet. The first thing Karen noticed was that the TV was still on, tuned to the channel that had just aired the Super Bowl. That wasn't too strange. But David was nowhere to be found. Karen called out his name, but there was no answer. She walked through the familiar rooms of their home, a little confused but not yet worried. She figured maybe he had gotten a last-minute invitation to watch the second half at a friend's house and just hadn't called. She noticed the VCR was still recording, This was classic David. He was known for recording all the major sporting events so he could watch them again later. The fact that the VCR was still running meant he hadn't been the one to turn it off. It was just another small, slightly odd detail. Karen continued her search, calling his name. She went into the kitchen, and that's when things started to feel a little more unsettling. She opened the refrigerator door, maybe looking for a note, or just seeing what was inside. And there, on a shelf, was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches. This was a sandwich David made all the time, his go-to snack. But why would he make 2 sandwiches and then just leave them in the fridge, uneaten? It didn't make sense. She closed the fridge door and turned around. On the kitchen counter, she saw something that made her pause. It was David's wedding band and his watch, just sitting there. Now, this was truly strange. A man might forget his wallet, but leaving behind his wedding ring and his watch was different. It felt personal. Still, Karen tried to rationalize it. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen or out of place. There was absolutely no evidence of a struggle. The house was exactly as it should be, just without David in it. Her best guess was that he had simply stepped out in a hurry and would be back soon. So, Karen waited up for a while, but as the hours ticked by, she eventually went to bed, telling herself he would surely be there in the morning. But when she woke up the next day, the other side of the bed was still empty. David had not come home. Now, real worry began to set in. The strange little details from the night before suddenly felt much more sinister. She knew something was wrong. She called the police and reported her husband missing. The Amarillo police began their investigation immediately. It didn't take them long to find a major clue. Within 24 hours, they located David's car. It was parked and abandoned in a downtown lot not far from the courthouse where he often worked. When they searched the vehicle, they found his keys, both for the car and the house, tucked away under one of the floor mats. Inside the car, everything seemed to be in order. His checkbook was there. His credit cards were in the glove compartment. His driver's license was right where it should be. Nothing of value had been taken. Investigators then looked into his recent financial activity, and that's when the story took another strange turn. They saw he had recently made a deposit of $5,000 into the family bank account. That seemed more like someone planning for their family's future than someone in trouble. But then they found something else. He had also recently purchased 2 one-way plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas back to Amarillo. Police couldn't determine if he had actually used these tickets, but it added to a growing theory that maybe David had chosen to disappear. When the police presented all of this to Karen, the abandoned car, the untouched valuables, the bank activity, she told them something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. She said that just before he disappeared, David had told her that he believed his life might be in danger. He was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month. It was for a complicated conflict of interest case involving his old law firm and one of their very wealthy, very powerful clients. According to Karen, David was being heavily pressured by his former colleagues to lie to cover up some of the firm's wrongdoings. But David was an honest man. He had told his family that he was going to tell the absolute truth in his deposition, no matter whose reputation it destroyed. He knew this decision would make him a lot of enemies. He understood that telling the truth put a huge target on his back. This information was a bombshell. The police were certainly intrigued. It painted a picture of a man caught in a dangerous situation, not one who would just walk away from his family. But the problem was, it was just a story. They had no hard evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David Lewis. It was a compelling theory, but without proof, it was just that, a theory. For the next 11 months, investigators followed every lead they could find. They interviewed his former colleagues. They looked into the wealthy client from the lawsuit, but they found nothing. no new information surfaced. There were no sightings of David. He never called home. He never used his credit cards or his social security number. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth. After nearly a year with no progress, the police officially decided to close the case. The official conclusion was that David Lewis had left of his own accord. They ruled out foul play. For David's family, this was a devastating blow. They had to try and accept the unacceptable, that David was gone, and they would likely never know what truly happened to him. The years passed, and the mystery of his disappearance remained a painful, open wound. Then, in 2004, 11 years after David vanished, something incredible happened. A state trooper in Washington state was sitting at his computer browsing the internet. He had an interest in unsolved mysteries and was looking through old cold cases. He clicked on a page and a picture of David Lewis popped up on his screen. The trooper stared at the photo. He felt an immediate jolt of recognition. The face looked exactly like an unidentified victim from a hit-and-run case he had worked on way back in 1993. His heart pounding, he pulled up the old case file. The details matched up in a chilling way. The John Doe victim had been struck by a vehicle and killed just one day after David Lewis was reported missing in Texas. The man had been found on the side of Highway 24 inches rural Washington state, a staggering 1,600 miles away from Amarillo. When he was found, this John Doe was dressed from head to toe in military-style clothing. He had no wallet, no identification, and no luggage or bags of any kind. He was just walking aimlessly down the side of a remote highway. Despite the immense distance and the strange circumstances, the trooper felt a growing certainty that this was David. But as he looked back at the picture of David Lewis, he noticed David was wearing glasses. He tried to remember if the John Doe from 1993 had been wearing glasses, and he didn't think so. It was a small detail, but it could be the one that proved him wrong. Just to be sure, he checked the evidence log, the list of personal belongings found on the body, and there it was. The John Doe did have a pair of glasses on him. And when he saw the description, it was a perfect match to the exact same kind of glasses David was wearing in his photo. It wasn't long before DNA testing was done, and the results came back as a definitive match. The John Doe from Washington was, without a doubt, David Lewis. After 11 long years, the mystery of where David went was finally solved. But it only opened up an even bigger, more disturbing mystery. Why? Why would David travel 1,600 miles to Washington, a state where he had no friends, no family, and no connections whatsoever? If he was the one who hit the record button on his VCR on Super Bowl night, that meant he had less than 24 hours to get from Amarillo, Texas, to that remote highway in Washington. He did it without his car, without his credit cards, and seemingly without any luggage. Where did the military clothing come from? Did he buy it? Or did someone make him wear it? What was he doing walking down that highway in the middle of nowhere? David's family has always believed that he was a victim of foul play. They believe his own words to his wife that his life was in danger because of the testimony he was about to give. They believe someone abducted him from his home, drove him across the country, and killed him, staging it to look like a random accident. But officially, the case remains closed. The police maintain that David Lewis left his home voluntarily, and his death on that lonely highway was nothing more than a tragic accident. In the year 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old woman living a quiet life in Houston, Texas. She worked as a loan officer at a Chase bank and was happily married to her husband, Jay. On the morning of October 12th, a Thursday, everything seemed perfectly normal. Mary Lou said goodbye to Jay and left for her job at the bank, just like she did every other weekday. That afternoon, Jay decided to give his wife a call at work just to check in. But she didn't pick up her phone. He left her a voicemail, figuring she was just busy with a customer and didn't think much of it. But as the afternoon wore on and she didn't call him back, a small seed of concern started to grow. This was very out of character for Mary Lou. She always returned his calls. By 5 p.m., when Mary Lou should have been finishing up her workday, Jay still hadn't heard from her. He called her again, but once more, the call went straight to voicemail. Now, his concern was turning into real worry. He decided to call Mary Lou's supervisor at the bank. The supervisor picked up, and Jay asked if he could speak to his wife. And the supervisor's response sent a chill down his spine. He told Jay that Mary Lou hadn't come into work at all that day. They had tried to get in touch with her as well, but couldn't reach her. In that moment, Jay knew something was terribly wrong. He immediately hung up and dialed 911, reporting his wife missing. The police had barely even started their search for Mary Lou when another call came into the station. It was from a man who had been riding his ATV on a remote dirt road about 3 miles from the Morris' home. He told the dispatcher that he had just stumbled upon a smoldering, burnt-out car, and he could see what looked like a body in the driver's seat. It turned out that the fire department had actually received a call earlier that day, around 10 inches the morning, about smoke being seen in that same area. But at the time, they had assumed it was just a controlled burn on someone's property, so they didn't send a unit out to investigate. When police and emergency services arrived at the scene, they found the car was completely destroyed by the fire. The body inside was so badly burned that it was impossible to visually identify who it was. Investigators carefully sifted through the wreckage, and they were able to find a small tooth fragment. They sent it off for testing, and soon their worst fears were confirmed. Dental records proved that the victim was indeed Mary Lou Morris. It was immediately clear to investigators that this was no accident. This was a homicide. They found evidence that gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the interior of the car before it was set ablaze. It seemed the killer had tried to stage the scene, perhaps to make it look like a suicide or a tragic car fire. But because of the intense damage from the fire, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. They didn't know if Mary Lou was already deceased when she was placed in the car, or if the fire itself was what killed her. As police processed the scene, they noted that a number of Mary Lou's valuables, like her purse, were still inside the car. But one very important item was missing. Her wedding ring was not on her finger. The news of Mary Lou's brutal murder shocked her family and the entire community. She was known as a kind, gentle person who didn't have a single enemy in the world. No one could understand why anyone would want to hurt her. The day after her body was found, the case took another bizarre turn. A local Houston newspaper received a phone call from an anonymous man. All he said was, Mary Lou's death was an accident. The reporter on the line tried to press him for more information, asking who he was and what he meant, but the man simply hung up. The call was untraceable. At the exact same time this tragedy was unfolding for the Morris family, a completely separate drama was playing out for another woman in Houston. Her name, coincidentally, was also Mary Morris. This was 9-year-old. Mary McGinnis Morris. She was a successful and well-liked nurse practitioner. She generally got along with everyone at the clinic where she worked, with one notable exception. A new male nurse, a man named Dwayne Young, had recently started working there, and he was making her feel extremely uncomfortable. He seemed to have a problem with her for no apparent reason. One day, Mary McGinnis returned to her desk after seeing a patient and found something deeply disturbing. All of the framed photos of her family that she kept on her desk had been turned face down. And in the very center of her desk was a small piece of paper with 3 words written on it, death to her. She knew in her gut that it had to be Dwayne. But she had no proof. That night, she went home and told her husband Mike about what had happened. She told him about Dwayne and the note, and she said, "I don't feel safe at work anymore." "Can you teach me how to shoot a gun?" Mike agreed. He took her to a range and taught her how to handle a firearm safely. He then bought her a small pistol, which she started keeping tucked under the driver's seat of her car, just in case. On October 16th, 4 days after Mary Lou Morris's body was found, and 3 days after that strange anonymous call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris finished her shift at the clinic and stopped at a drugstore on her way home. As soon as she walked inside, she noticed a man on the other side of the store who seemed to be watching her every move. She felt a wave of fear and immediately pulled out her cell phone and called her best friend, Lori. She described the strange man to Lori and asked what she should do. Lori told her to just wait, to pretend to shop until the man left the store. But the man didn't leave. He just stayed there, lingering in an aisle, staring at her. Finally, Mary McGinnis decided she couldn't wait any longer. She told Lori, "You know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I have to make a quick stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes." "I'll be fine." She hung up the phone, walked to the register, bought her items, and left the store. Just 12 minutes later, a frantic 911 call came in. It was Mary McGinnis Morris. The dispatcher could hear the sheer terror in her voice as she screamed that someone was trying to kill her. The contents of that 911 call have never been made public, reportedly because on the recording, you can actually hear the moment she is attacked. Later that night, Mary McGinnis was found in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her terrified 911 call that this was a homicide. But just like with the first Mary Morris, her killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like a suicide. The murder weapon, which was her own pistol that she kept under her seat, had been carefully placed on the seat next to her hand. None of her valuables had been stolen from the car. But, just like Mary Lou Morris, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After the murder of the second Mary Morris, police and the public began to speculate that these two cases had to be connected. It was just too much of a coincidence. Two women, sharing the same name, living in the same city, murdered within days of each other. In both cases, the crime scenes were staged to look self-inflicted. And in both cases, the victim's wedding ring was taken. A chilling theory began to form. This was a professional hit gone horribly wrong. The people who subscribed to this theory believed that Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target all along, and that the murder of Mary Lou Morris was a tragic mistake. They reasoned that a hitman was hired, given the name Mary Morris and a general location, and he simply killed the wrong woman first. Then, upon realizing his mistake, he was the one who anonymously called the newspaper to say her death was an accident. And a few days later, the hit was successfully carried out on the correct target, Mary McGinnis Morris. The detail about the missing wedding rings supported this theory, as it's reportedly a common practice for hitmen to take a personal item like that to prove to their client that the job is done. Police took this theory very seriously and began looking into who might want Mary McGinnis Morris dead. Their attention quickly turned to her husband, Mike. They discovered that he had recently accused her of having an affair and was said to be extremely angry about it. He also behaved suspiciously after her murder, refusing to take a polygraph test and not allowing the police to interview his daughter. And then there was the motive. Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy, and Mike was the sole beneficiary. It seemed like a classic case of a husband hiring a hitman to kill his wife. But when investigators dug deeper, they couldn't find a single piece of evidence that tied Mike to either his wife's murder or the murder of Mary Lou Morris. As for her creepy coworker, Dwayne Young, who wrote the death to her note, police determined that while he clearly disliked her, he was not involved in her death. And so, both of these incredibly strange and tragic cases went cold. To this day, no one has ever been arrested or charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was a 31-year-old man living in Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. In his past, he had some struggles with alcoholism and substance abuse, but for the last 2 years, he had completely turned his life around. He was clean, sober, and had landed a great job as a foreman for a local construction company. He was known as a friendly, cheerful guy who was easy to get along with and had no known enemies. But in the summer of that year, something changed in Blair. He started exhibiting strange and uncharacteristic mood swings. His mother would later describe them as being frequent and wild. In just a matter of weeks, the calm, relaxed, and friendly man she knew transformed into someone who was constantly panicked and on edge. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. The stress was so intense that he couldn't sleep at night. He began telling his friends and coworkers that he was convinced someone was trying to kill him. They were concerned, telling him that he wasn't okay and that he really needed to see a doctor. When his mother confronted him about his increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior, he was secretive. He told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." She pressed him, asking, "What's it?" But he just shook his head and said, "I can't say anything else." And that was all she could ever get out of him. Blair's strange behavior reached a crisis point on Friday, July 5th. He went to his bank and withdrew his entire life savings in cash, a total of $6,000. He then went to his safety deposit box and emptied it as well. It contained thousands of dollars worth of gold, platinum, and expensive jewelry. It was the kind of thing someone does when they're planning to run. 2 days later, on Sunday, he got in his car and drove 30 minutes to the U.S. Canada border. He attempted to cross into the United States, but he was turned away. To the border guards, he was a collection of red flags. A single man traveling alone, carrying a large amount of cash and valuables, and acting extremely nervous. He fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and they denied him entry. Frustrated, Blair drove back home. The next day, Monday, he showed up at his construction site and walked straight into his boss's office. He abruptly announced that he was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't even bother to pick up his final paycheck. He just turned around and walked away. From the construction site, he went directly to the airport. There, he walked up to a ticket counter and purchased a round-trip ticket to Frankfurt, Germany for $1,600. No one knows for sure why he wanted to go to Germany, but he had worked there briefly the year before. His flight was scheduled to depart the following day, on Tuesday. But as soon as he bought the ticket, Blair seemed to change his mind again. He suddenly decided he needed to try and get into the United States one more time. He rushed from the airport to a female friend's house. When she opened the door, she was shocked by his appearance. He looked completely disheveled and terrified. He told her, "Someone's trying to kill me. I need your help. Can you drive me across the border? They just rejected me a couple of days ago. You have kids. It'll look more convincing if I'm with a family." His friend was seriously spooked by his frantic behavior and told him she couldn't help. So Blair went home and hid out for the rest of the day. The next morning, Tuesday, he went back to the airport. But instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, he went to the ticket counter and asked for a refund. He told the agent that the person he was supposed to meet in Germany had gotten sick, so he couldn't go. The only person this could have been was a woman he had a brief fling with while working there the year before. But later, when investigators spoke to this German woman, she told them she hadn't been in touch with Blair at all and was definitely not expecting him to visit. After getting his refund, Blair left the airport and went to a car rental agency where he rented a Nissan Altima. He immediately drove back to the U.S. Canada border, and this time, for whatever reason, he was allowed to cross. He drove south to Seattle, Washington, went straight to the airport there, and simply abandoned his rental car in the middle of a parking lot. He then went inside and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. The ticket cost him $770. He could have bought a round-trip ticket for about half that price, but he specifically chose the more expensive one-way option. He boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was on the other side of the country in Washington, D.C. As soon as he got off the plane, he rented another car, this time a Toyota Camry, and started driving again. He drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair wasn't seen in Knoxville until around 5:30 that evening when he pulled into a gas station. He told the attendant that he was having trouble with his car. The attendant came out to take a look, and he immediately figured out the problem. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to the Nissan Altima he had abandoned in Seattle. The attendant pointed this out, but Blair, clearly confused, held up the key and insisted, "No, this is the one I was using." The attendant pointed to the Nissan logo on the key. Together, they searched the car inside and out, looking for the missing Toyota key, but it was nowhere to be found. Blair tried calling the rental company, but their office was already closed for the day. The gas station attendant told him there was nothing more he could do and that they would have to tow the car. But he offered to give Blair a ride to a nearby hotel. Blair accepted. Just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front doors of a Fairfield Inn. Hotel security footage captured what happened next. He walked in, stood in the lobby for a moment, then turned around and walked right back out. A few minutes later, he walked in again, and then walked out again. He did this over and over 5 separate times over the course of an hour. Finally, he approached the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk clerk later told police that Blair seemed completely paranoid. He was constantly looking over his shoulder and was visibly on edge the entire time. She gave him his room key, he paid in cash, and then instead of going up to his room, he turned around, walked out the front door one last time, and never came back. The next morning, 2 construction workers arrived at their job site, which was located in a vacant lot directly across the street from the Fairfield Inn. As they started their day, they discovered a body. It was Blair Adams. He was lying on the ground, and strangely, he was missing his shoes, his socks, and his pants. He had several scratches on his hands and face, but none of the injuries were life-threatening. Scattered on the ground all around his body was $4,000 in a mix of American, Canadian, and German currency. His fanny pack, full of all the expensive gold and jewelry from his safety deposit box, was also lying nearby. A black duffel bag containing maps and travel receipts was on the ground. And also, lying in the dirt, was the missing key to the Toyota Camry. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner determined that Blair had died from a single massive violent blow to his stomach that had ruptured his organs. They had no idea what could have caused such an injury. A toxicology report came back clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only piece of forensic evidence found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was found clutching tightly in his fist. There were no witnesses to the attack, but a security guard at a nearby business reported hearing a woman's scream coming from the direction of the lot at around 3:30 that morning. The only real lead police had was a composite sketch of a man who several people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant shortly after he had left the hotel for the final time. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were completely baffled. Was Blair telling the truth all along? Had someone been hunting him for weeks, finally catching up to him in a vacant lot in Tennessee? If so, why didn't they take the thousands of dollars in cash and valuables that were lying right next to his body? Or was Blair suffering from a severe paranoid delusion, and his death was the result of a random, tragic encounter with a violent stranger? To this day, we still have no idea. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 6th of May, 2008, a 54-year-old man named Ricky Williams stood on a riverbank in Western Virginia. He was casting his fishing line out into the calm waters of a place called Dismal Creek. Ricky was really hoping to catch some trout. He'd been out here for a good 30 minutes already, but so far, he hadn't gotten a single bite. Now, on a normal day, Ricky wouldn't have minded. He was the kind of guy who could fish for hours and just enjoy the peace and quiet. But today was different. Today, he and his dog, who was sitting right beside him, were seriously hungry. They'd been camping out in these woods for several weeks, and their food supply had finally dwindled down to almost nothing. So, if Ricky didn't catch any fish today, there was a very real chance neither he nor his dog would eat. For a little bit of context, the place where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, had a bleak name, but it was actually a beautiful, very secluded spot. It was high up on a mountain that was part of the Appalachian Trail. And the Appalachian Trail is this very famous, very long trail, about 2,200 miles, that runs all the way up and down the east coast of the United States. What's really important about the Appalachian Trail is that there's a kind of unwritten code among the people who hike it. All the hikers know this code. It's simple. If you come across another hiker on the trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need it. And in turn, it's their responsibility to help you if you're the one in trouble. It's like this built-in community of people who are always looking out for one another. And so, Ricky was very aware of this code. As he stood there, casting his line again and again with no luck, he was secretly hoping that a hiker, or maybe a group of them, would wander by. Maybe they'd see him, come down to the creek, find out he needed food, and just offer him some of theirs. But another half an hour went by. No hikers appeared. And still, Ricky could not catch a single fish. Then, all of a sudden, Ricky's dog started to whine. It began shifting around, almost like it could sense a predator was nearby. As Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he heard a voice coming from the woods right behind him. Someone was definitely moving towards him. When Ricky heard this voice, he felt two things at once. On one hand, he was excited. Maybe this was finally a hiker who could give him some food. But, on the other hand, Ricky couldn't shake this feeling of deep unease. You have to understand, Ricky was an older guy. He was kind of frail. And over the past few weeks, as his food had run out, he had gotten skinnier and skinnier. He really didn't pose a threat to anyone. He was just this weak, older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place. But over the last few decades, there had been several murders that took place right on the trail. And in fact, one of those killings had happened less than 2 miles away from the very spot where Ricky was fishing with his dog. In that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot 2 hikers to death. So, while Ricky was desperate for help from a fellow hiker, he couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. Again, Ricky was a small, frail guy, and he knew all about these murders. He knew he was extremely close to one of the murder sites. And so, Ricky was totally on edge as he listened to this male voice getting closer and closer. Finally, a man in his early 30s stepped out from the tree line. He looked over and saw Ricky. For a second, the two men just stared at each other. But then, this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And in that instant, Ricky felt a wave of relief. He could tell just by looking at this guy that he probably wasn't a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston. He told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing just like Ricky was. Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" Scott was like, "Absolutely." He dug into the bag he was carrying and pulled out a couple of energy bars and a bag of chips. He tossed them over to Ricky. He also gave Ricky some fresh bait so he could cast his line out again. For the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood there on the riverbank fishing together. And after a while, the trout actually did start biting. They started catching fish. The day was turning into a pretty great outing for Ricky. And it got even better. As soon as they were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back at their campsite for dinner. Remember, Ricky had no food. This was an amazing invitation. He said yes, of course, he'd love to. So, the two men packed up their fishing gear right as the sun was starting to go down. Then, they began walking back into the forest in the same direction Scott had come from. As they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled up on a low-hanging branch. He was really struggling to get it free from the tree. Finally, he just told Ricky to go on ahead. He said, "My campsite is right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill and you'll see it." Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine. Go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill by himself. When he walked out of the tree line and into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, the first thing Ricky noticed was this enormous man. He looked like he was twice the size of Scott, which made him about 4 times the size of Ricky. He was kind of hunched over the campfire. This huge man, who Ricky assumed was Scott's friend, heard him walk into the clearing. You have to remember, it was getting dark, and they were kind of in the middle of nowhere. So this guy, he whipped his head around and saw this strange man just standing there at the edge of his camp. Scott was nowhere to be found. And so this big guy, he immediately grabbed a club like a thick piece of wood, and he looked at Ricky menacingly with a look that said, "What are you doing here?" Ricky was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was. He put his hands up and said, "I'm so sorry. Scott sent me up here." I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry. But just at that moment, Scott had finally untangled his fishing line, and he came walking out of the tree line. He saw what was happening, walked over, and patted Ricky on the back. He said, "Oh, you've already met my friend, Sean." As soon as Scott said that, Sean seemed to let his guard down. He put the piece of wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky got the distinct feeling that Sean was not happy that he was in his campsite, even though Scott was clearly the reason he was there. Ricky just felt really, really uncomfortable. At the same time, Scott was ushering him closer to the campfire, telling him to take a seat next to Sean. Scott was saying, "Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. You know, take a seat." Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was being so pushy, really forcing him to stay. But Ricky didn't want to be rude and just abruptly leave, so he did as he was told. He took a seat right next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to him. And Ricky just sort of sat there, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was Scott walked over to Sean and handed him all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so Sean could start preparing them for cooking. Then, as Ricky was still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire. He went over to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. Scott turned on the radio and just started blasting country music. When Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced. To him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. So to him, it felt almost disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. To Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something off about these two guys. They just seemed really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe even aggressive. So Ricky was not happy. But again, he didn't say anything. He didn't try to leave. Because again, he was really hungry, and so was his dog. He needed to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean. Then, he and Sean both pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. As they were doing this, Ricky again was just kind of sitting there, doing nothing. So he sort of meekly asked, "Hey, can you give me a knife? I'll clean a fish." But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, "Don't worry, we got this." And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously. All he could do was watch the firelight flashing and bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away. At that point, they started cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly, for Rick actually, it felt like the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now, the two men weren't fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. So Ricky started to make some small talk, hoping it would settle his nerves. He told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. Ricky told them that sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at his actual home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for him. He even told Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting, like it was part of a ritual. He was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed that the two men were definitely paying attention. They were kind of nodding along at the appropriate points in his story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like he was weird. As if they weren't prepared to say it out loud, but after hearing all these things about his life, they were thinking, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seemed like they didn't quite like him or even really want him there. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish was done. And so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, it was about 8 o'clock at night. It was very dark outside. And Ricky, at this point, was just ready to go. He still felt so uneasy there. So, after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up, grabbed his dog, and began walking into the woods towards his own campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the campsite, two things happened in very rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and he turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky, Sean, and Scott had been, there were these two women. They were in their house eating dinner when they heard a sudden, frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women lived in a very isolated part of the country, so they were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other one very carefully made her way towards the front of the house. She kind of peered out the window, but she couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark. And so she went to her door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there. The woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack. And what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood. It was as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he was all red. The man had his hand pressed over his neck, and the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out from his neck in time with his heart. This man was clearly bleeding to death, and so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. She yelled, "We have someone who's dying here." And so the other woman started calling 911. Then the man on the porch just said, "Please help me." And then he said something about Dismal Creek, and then he collapsed. This was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up, and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house. She hadn't even registered it until now. So either this guy got dropped off, or he had driven that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. The medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek. Because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who showed up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so, instead of trying to wait and figure out what was even going on, the police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around. Let's see if we can figure out why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road, coming straight at them. The truck, it initially hit its brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again. And they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment. The truck crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. The police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen. And they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their cars and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver. And he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance. But they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. Once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything had happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seemed like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lived here. The campsite itself was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives, along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area. So you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses. And there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also, there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent. All over this map, along the trail, were all these spots that were circled. But there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio. And inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play. And immediately, what they heard totally creeped them out. Because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate. And the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew. And in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail would definitely know this name. The identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too. And they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face, and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott. And he shoots at him, and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow, Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot this second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott, and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside. And they shut the door and they sped away towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep. And both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then, as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother, and he wore this electronic bracelet. And, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had come off. And even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money. And so ultimately, he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on the 6th of May, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981, or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell. And very likely, he viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This was his home. this was the place he loved more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall, because amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own. And so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database. And so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of, obviously, Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth. Because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest. And Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking. And they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.